Indeed, it's very hard to find completely clean, highly effective police generals, but it's an improvement on Budi Gunawan. But some of the protégés of Budi Gunawan who are conducting a relentless campaign against the leadership of the Anti-Corruption Commission remain in place. The head of the National Detective Division is one of those people who remains in place, Budi Waseso. So as long as some of those people remain in place, harm continues to be done. Jokowi, at the same time, has appointed 3 new commissioners, temporary commissioners to the Anti-Corruption Commission. One of those has a charge against him. The police are pursuing a charge against him. Another of those appointees is someone who seems to have close links to the Suharto era elite, and there are questions about his integrity to be working in such a sensitive position. So again, a lot of Jokowi's positions, a lot of the decisions that he's taking are containing compromises that are not really in step with his avowed aim of cleaning up Indonesian politics. And what's more, if he doesn't take really strong action against what the police is doing, the result will be a greatly less effective Anti-Corruption Commission. And this is crucial for Jokowi. The Anti-Corruption Commission is probably the most important institution to cleaning up Indonesian politics, or to retaining some kind of cleanliness in Indonesian politics. So if he allows that to be emasculated, well then that will be a very big black mark against his name.
Are we being unfair to Jokowi? Can Indonesian politics truly be clean as they currently stand? What hope is there, particularly with the perpetuation of oligarchs within the system itself?
Indeed, it's a massive task, and I think everyone expected that he would have to make compromises, that there would be some cabinet ministers who were not to his liking, but they were the price he had to pay for keeping coalition partners happy. But I think it's the extent of the compromises and the kind of either regressive or low competence ministers who have been appointed, that's been the surprise. We would have thought there would be 20–30% of ministers like that, and instead I think the percentage is higher. And some of the appointments are in key portfolios, such as the Defence Minister, and this is a very important portfolio for Jokowi, and many of us feel as if he didn't have to make that appointment. There are other options open to him. So yes, compromise is certainly necessary. You can't take on all of the vested interests in Indonesian politics in one go, but I certainly expected him to confront them in a more systematic way than what he's done. And in fact, before he was inaugurated as president, he sent out some of his most trusted advisors to tell people in key parts of the elite that things were going to change, that the kind of cartel arrangements that they had, or the kinds of political chicanery they have gotten up to, would no longer be tolerated. And so it looked as if he was putting in place a system of measures that would really strike a blow against old-style Indonesian politics. And when it came to the crunch, he did hardly any of those things. There are a few areas. Oil and gas was one area he attempted to clean up. There are a number of good appointments in the cabinet, but nowhere near enough to make the kind of difference that he talked about. So the job is not impossible to bring about reform. It just requires a good deal of fortitude and I think political savviness. And what's disappointed me is that Jokowi has shown far too little of either of those qualities. For a man who's had the kind of meteoric rise that he's had, he's taken a lot of risks. He's been very clever in the way he's navigated his way through various competing forces. But we're not finding that now that he's in the presidential palace.
And speaking of compromise, Greg, are Jokowi's actions also testament to his ability or inability to manage that relationship with Megawati Sukarno Putri and the PDIP, or is it something else in your mind?
It's more than just Megawati and PDIP, although that remains perhaps one of the most, or the most significant problem for him inside his own coalition. He has another big problem in the form of Surya Palo, who is basically the boss of the National Democratic Party, and Surya Palo is a very big businessman, and he has also pushed Jokowi into making a number of appointments which were really not at all reform, inimical to a reform process. So they're really the two groups of people who have caused Jokowi most problems as president. I suppose, and it's hard for us to know enough about what's been going on behind the scenes, particularly what's been going on in the palace, to know for sure. But there's a clear impression that he hasn't been willing to push things to the brink. So, for example, when the cabinet was being put together, Megawati was insisting on certain of her people being appointed, and people to whom Jokowi clearly objected. Rather than Jokowi saying no, he continued to visit Megawati's house. He continued to seek out advice about what she was thinking about these issues, but he was the president. The game should have changed at that point. And indeed, he spoke to people before he was inaugurated, and he said, the game will change at that point. When I have all the authority of the president, I will assert myself. And in fact, he didn't. He looked subordinate, he looked compliant. And I think that sent out messages to a lot of people in the political system that if you apply enough pressure, you'll be able to, at the very least, get Jokowi to compromise a great deal, and you might be able to get him to back down entirely on his preferred choices. And so that's the process that seems to me to have been in play with people like Megawati and also Surya Palo.
Now, you alluded to this earlier, Greg. A lot of Jokowi's compromises seem to speak against his notion of reform and his promise of reform, but also if we turn now to the case of the Bali Nine and the two Australians on death row, his decision not to grant clemency and go ahead with these executions as a matter of policy seemed to really speak against Jokowi's socially progressive promise and nature. What do you make of this decision to not even countenance clemency under any circumstances?
I think there's several possible interpretations, and some of it comes back to Jokowi's own personality. And indeed, it's becoming increasingly clear how little we do know about what he really thinks. He gives very little of himself away in any of his public statements. There tend to be very anodyne things about his past, but as to his current thinking, his face has hardly any expression on it whenever he gives interviews, and particularly when he's talking about important things. So Yudhoyono, for example, if he was making a statement about something he felt strongly about, you would often see the emotion on his face. It was clear that this was something that meant a lot to him. But Jokowi looks much more impassive, so he's a difficult man to read, and it's hard to know whether he's experiencing any kind of inner turmoil about a decision, such as executing a dozen people or more. Having said that, I think it's also revealing about the politics. So Jokowi made this decision in the first month of his presidency. I think there's probably a lot of truth to what the Fairfax media has been reporting, that Jokowi didn't have anywhere near enough information in which to make these decisions at the time in which he made it, this blanket rejection of all clemency pleas. And he made that decision seemingly to look tough. Lots of observers have commented on this, at a time when he was already being criticised. I think his refusal to budge from that position is indicative of perhaps a more socially conservative attitude than we had imagined that he had. And so he may well indeed, as a matter of principle, find nothing to object to in the death penalty. I think there's a certain lack of intellectual engagement or philosophical engagement, perhaps even moral engagement with this issue as well. So there's plenty of information available that the figures that Jokowi is quoting for the death toll rising from hard drugs and for the number of Indonesians who are addicted to hard drugs is probably greatly inflated. They're certainly not reliable figures to be quoting day in, day out. Nonetheless, Jokowi continues to do so. He also hasn't in any way engaged with the debate about the effectiveness of the death penalty as a deterrent. And so the whole question of the efficacy of state execution of people, and if they execute the next batch of 12 or so, well, that'll bring to 18 people in a few months whose lives he has taken away, in effect. And he doesn't give any impression of being perturbed about that, or of going through an internal debate about whether this is justified. And he could easily leave those people in jail, because most of them, if their sentences are commuted, they've got life sentences. He could also stall the process. Many Indonesian presidents have done that. He didn't have to bring matters to the head in the way he's done, but he has done so, and I think it's not only for political reasons, but I think he himself believes that he should just act on this matter. So we're learning things about Jokowi as a result of this process. And for people who have a more progressive set of views, they're not particularly pleasant things.
Is there any chance that he will do a U-turn and change his decision? There's been a lot of agitation from Australia, particularly our Foreign Minister and Prime Minister, which undoubtedly is probably not helpful in the way it's been framed. But is there any chance that Jokowi might reverse his decision in this case?
I'm sorry to say I see almost zero prospect of him changing his attitude, partly because he has already made an emphatic public commitment to continue with the executions. He must be mindful of the kind of political flack that Yudhoyono copped when he showed leniency towards Schapelle Corby. So there's no votes for an Indonesian president to be seen to be soft on drug dealers, and there's probably a great deal of political harm. But moreover, I think Jokowi, he's not much concerned about what other countries think, and particularly Western countries. And that's also completely different from Yudhoyono, who was always preoccupied with Indonesia's international standing. So the kind of reputational harm that Indonesia has been suffering over these, and it's not just in Australia, it's in Brazil and the Netherlands and lots of other countries, and this will continue if he proceeds with the executions. I don't think that particularly worries Jokowi at all. He's a very domestically focused politician. He knows very little about international affairs, aside from some economic issues, and the whole business of diplomacy is something that's rather abstract to him. And I also think it does come back to the point that he probably doesn't see the death penalty as a bad thing, and he may well have what I take to be a rather simplistic view, that the death penalty will indeed help to curb drugs. Now, I think if he really wanted to solve the problem of hard drug distribution in Indonesia, he would look at his own police force. There have been a number of police generals and other senior officers who've been charged and convicted for their involvement in drug business. There's a lot of media and other reporting and academic studies to show the heavy involvement in police in the drug industry, but he's not touching that. He's taking the easy option. So that is also somewhat contrary. No one expected he would confront the police and seek overnight change and withdrawal from these things. But what he could do is more purposefully support the measures that would gradually put very high disincentives on police officers becoming involved in not only drug trade but other forms of corruption, by empowering, Anti-Corruption Commission, all sorts of other investigative agencies who might be looking at this. And that's what he's not doing. And so the core problem remains, I think, and killing foreigners who've been running drugs